The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting warm, golden light across the kitchen of the Carter household. The smell of baked lasagna lingered in the air, mingling with laughter that seemed to wrap the room in a bubble of joy. Ruth Carter, dressed casually in jeans and a loose blouse, leaned against the counter, watching her daughter Ella excitedly wave a college acceptance letter in the air. Ella's smile was radiant, the kind that lit up her whole face. "Mom, can you believe it? Full ride. They picked me," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with equal parts excitement and disbelief. Ruth felt a swell of pride that nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You earned this, baby," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Every late night, every test you stayed up for, it's all paying off." Ella ran over and wrapped her arms around her mother. Ruth held her tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her daughter's hair. This was what she worked for, the late nights in the Senate, the countless battles to make the world a little fairer, all for moments like this. For Ella to have opportunities Ruth could only dream of when she was her age. The two of them pulled apart, laughing softly as Ella wiped her eyes. "Okay," Ella said, grinning, "but you have to promise not to embarrass me when we visit campus." Ruth rolled her eyes. "Me? Embarrass you? Never." Their laughter rang through the room again, filling every corner with warmth. The ringing phone shattered the moment. Ruth glanced at it, her heart sinking slightly at the sight of the number. It was her chief of staff. She hesitated for a beat before picking up, keeping her tone light. "This better be good news, Mel," she joked. But Mel's voice on the other end was anything but light. "Ruth, we've got a problem. A protest downtown got out of hand. A young man was hurt, Jamal Bennett. He's in police custody, and witnesses are saying excessive force was involved." Ruth's stomach tightened. Excessive force was code. She had heard it too many times before, each instance a stain on her community, her conscience. Ella noticed the change in her mother's expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Ruth gave her a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Work," she said simply. "I'll be back soon." Ella frowned, but didn't press further. Ruth grabbed her coat, her mind already racing as she headed out the door. The scene at the precinct was tense, a powder keg ready to blow. A small crowd of protesters had gathered outside, their voices a mix of anger and despair. Ruth's car pulled up to the curb, and the crowd parted slightly as they recognized her. Some called out her name, pleading for answers, for justice. Ruth raised a hand, her expression calm but firm. She didn't have answers yet, but she would. She had to. Inside the precinct, the air was thick with tension. Officers milled about, their faces hard and unreadable. Ruth walked in, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, each step purposeful. She spotted the desk sergeant and approached him. "I'm Senator Carter," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge. "I need to see Jamal Bennett." The sergeant barely looked up. "He's being processed," he said dismissively. Ruth didn't flinch. "Processed? He was injured. I need to know his condition, and I need to see him now." Before the sergeant could respond, a voice cut through the room like a knife. "Senator Carter," it said, dripping with false politeness. Ruth turned to see Officer Greg Turner approaching, his swagger unmistakable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer. "What brings you to our humble precinct tonight?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. Ruth met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I'm here for Jamal Bennett," she said evenly. "I've heard troubling reports, and I want to make sure he's receiving proper care." Turner chuckled, a sound that made Ruth's skin crawl. "Troubling reports," he repeated mockingly. "You mean rumors from people who don't understand how we do our jobs?" Ruth's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. "I'm not here to debate policing methods," she said. "I'm here to see Jamal. Now." Turner stepped closer, his presence looming. "With all due respect, Senator, this is a police matter. You might want to stick to what you're good at, giving speeches." Ruth didn't blink. "And with all due respect, Officer Turner, I represent this district. When one of my constituents is hurt, it becomes my matter. So, unless you're prepared to explain why a public servant can't access public information, I suggest you let me see him." The room went quiet, the tension palpable. Turner's sneer faltered for a fraction of a second before he stepped aside. "Right this way," he said, his tone icy. Ruth followed him down a dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding but her expression resolute. They reached a holding cell where Jamil sat, his face bruised and swollen. Ruth's chest tightened at the sight, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Jamil," she said gently. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and fear. "Senator Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "I'm here," she said. "We're going to get this sorted out. You're not alone." Turner leaned against the doorframe, watching with thinly veiled disdain. "You've seen him, Senator." Satisfied, Ruth turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Not even close," she said. "I'll be speaking to my legal team. Expect a call." Turner's smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do what you have to do," he said. "We've got nothing to hide." Ruth didn't respond. She simply turned on her heel and walked out, her mind already racing with plans. Back in her car, Ruth took a deep breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She knew this was just the beginning. Turner wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symptom of a broken system, and if she was going to take him on, she had to be prepared for a fight. But as she glanced at her phone and saw Ella's smiling face as her screensaver, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The night was quiet except for the soft hum of the streetlight outside, casting a faint glow into the modest living room where Ruth Carter sat, an open laptop on her knees and a stack of papers spread across the coffee table. Ella, her 17-year-old daughter, lounged nearby with a textbook open in her lap. "Mom, how do you spell perseverance?" Ella asked without looking up. Ruth smiled, her gaze softening. "Perseverance," she replied, leaning back against the couch. "It's like the story of our lives, isn't it?" Ella let out a quiet laugh, nodding. "Yeah, it's our thing." Ruth's smile faded slightly as her mind drifted. Perseverance. It was more than a word. It was the air she breathed, the force that propelled her forward when every door seemed to slam shut. She glanced at Ella, who had her father's thoughtful eyes and her own determination. Ruth felt a surge of pride mixed with a pang of sorrow. Ella's life would be different. It had to be. The memory surfaced before Ruth could stop it, sharp and vivid. She was 19 again, a girl sitting on the cold metal bench of a precinct holding cell, her hands trembling as she clutched a scrap of paper. The charges were bogus, loitering, disturbing the peace, but Ruth knew what it was really about. She had dared to stand up for herself and her friends in front of an officer who didn't think a black girl belonged in his town. Officer Greg Turner, then a rookie with a cruel smile, had been the one to cuff her. "You'll learn your place," he had muttered under his breath as he pushed her into the squad car. Ruth had vowed that day never to let anyone make her feel powerless again. "Mom," Ella's voice broke through the memory, pulling Ruth back to the present. "You okay?" Ruth blinked and nodded quickly. "Yeah, just thinking," she said, closing her laptop and setting it aside. She reached out and ran a hand over Ella's hair. "You remind me so much of your dad," she said softly. "Focused, stubborn." Ella laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, leaning into her mother's touch. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the quiet moment. Ruth glanced at the screen, her expression hardening slightly. It was a text from one of her aides, a reminder about tomorrow's town hall meeting, where the precinct would be a major topic of discussion. Ruth set the phone down without replying. She had been fighting this battle for years: police reform, justice for the marginalized, equity for her community. It was exhausting work, but it was her calling. And yet, some battles never seem to end. The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking 10 p.m. Ruth sighed and stood, stretching her arms above her head. "Time for bed, kiddo," she said. Ella groaned in protest. "Just a few more minutes," she pleaded, holding up her textbook. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Don't push your luck," she teased, her tone light but firm. Ella grinned and gathered her things, heading upstairs. Ruth watched her go, a mix of pride and worry flickering in her chest. Ella was her world, her anchor. Everything Ruth did was for her. As the house fell quiet, Ruth returned to the papers on the coffee table. She skimmed through the notes, her eyes lingering on one name: Jamal Bennett, a young man, barely older than Ella, who had been brutalized during a routine traffic stop. The details were hauntingly familiar, echoing her own experience decades ago. The same precinct, the same abuse of power. Her jaw tightened as she read on. This wasn't just a case. It was a reminder of everything she had been fighting against since the day she entered politics. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Ruth frowned, glancing at the clock again. It was late for visitors. She approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was Mr. Daniels, her elderly neighbor, looking anxious. Ruth opened the door, her expression concerned. "Mr. Daniels, is everything okay?" she asked. He shook his head, his hands trembling. "Ruth, I didn't know who else to call," he said, his voice shaking. "It's my grandson, Micah. He's out with his friends, and there's been talk about the police cracking down tonight. I'm worried." Ruth felt her heart squeeze. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'll make some calls," she said firmly. "We'll find him, Mr. Daniels." She grabbed her phone and dialed one of her community contacts, her mind already racing. This was why she had entered public service: to be the voice for those who had none, to fight for people like Mr. Daniels and Micah. As she hung up, she caught her reflection in the mirror by the door. The lines on her face told the story of every battle she had fought, every sleepless night spent drafting legislation, every protest she had marched in. But her eyes still burned with the fire that had driven her since she was 19 years old, sitting on that cold metal bench. The next morning, Ruth stood on the steps of the community center, addressing a crowd that had gathered for the town hall. Her voice was steady, her words measured but powerful. She spoke about the need for accountability, for justice, for a system that served everyone, not just the privileged few. As she spoke, her eyes swept over the crowd, landing briefly on Officer Turner, who stood at the edge with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. The sight of him sent a jolt through her, but she didn't falter. She had faced him before, and she would face him again. After the meeting, a young woman approached Ruth, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Senator Carter, thank you for everything you do," she said. "People like me wouldn't have a chance without you." Ruth smiled, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "We all have a chance," she said firmly. "We just have to fight for it." As Ruth walked back to her car, she felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. The road ahead was long, and the battles were far from over. But as she thought of Ella, of Mr. Daniels, of every person who had ever looked to her for hope, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The sun was relentless, beating down on the crowded steps of City Hall, where cameras flashed and microphones hovered like hungry vultures. Senator Ruth Carter stood tall, her navy suit crisp, her face a calm mask of determination. Behind her, a group of community leaders flanked her like a wall of solidarity, their expressions mirroring the simmering anger of the crowd gathered below. The events of last night were not just an accident, Ruth began, her voice steady but sharp. They were a result of unchecked power and systemic prejudice. Jamil Bennett was not just another statistic. He is a son, a brother, a member of this community, and he deserves justice. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices swelling like a wave. Ruth gripped the edges of the podium, the heat from the wooden surface grounding her. She knew the man standing in the wings, just out of camera view, was waiting for his moment. Officer Greg Turner, the face of the precinct and the source of her mounting frustration, stepped forward, his posture exuding arrogance. "With all due respect, Senator," Turner interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "let's not jump to conclusions here. This isn't about justice. It's about troublemakers who don't know how to follow the law." The crowd's cheers turned to murmurs, uncertainty rippling through them. Ruth's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Troublemakers," she repeated, turning to face Turner directly. Her voice carried a quiet fury now, each word deliberate. Jamil Bennett was sitting in his car, waiting for a friend, when your officers dragged him out and beat him. Tell me, Officer Turner, is that what you call following the law? The tension between them was electric, the kind of moment reporters dreamed of. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion. Turner's smirk deepened, the lines around his eyes crinkling with false charm. "I think we all know how these situations escalate, Senator," he said smoothly. "And let's not forget, your presence here today isn't exactly neutral. You're a politician after all. Gotta keep those votes rolling in, right?" The jab landed like a punch, and Ruth heard a few gasps from the crowd. For a moment, her vision blurred with anger, but she drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "My role here isn't about politics," Ruth shot back, her voice rising just enough to carry over the murmurs. "It's about accountability, something your department seems to lack entirely." Turner's face darkened slightly, the smugness giving way to a flicker of irritation. "Our officers risk their lives every day," he said, his tone sharpening. "And frankly, it's insulting to have someone who's never worn the badge lecture us about what's right and wrong." Ruth's pulse quickened, but she didn't let him see it. She stepped closer to the edge of the podium, her gaze piercing. "What's truly insulting," she said, her voice cutting like glass, "is watching those entrusted to serve and protect use their power to harm the very people they're meant to protect. That's not bravery, Officer Turner. That's cowardice." The crowd roared its approval, the noise drowning out whatever retort Turner had been preparing. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening as he stepped back. Later that night, Ruth sat in her kitchen, the tension from the press conference still clinging to her like a second skin. The light from her phone screen illuminated her tired features as she scrolled through the headlines. Senator Carter versus Officer Turner, a battle of wills, read one. Another, more biting headline, declared, "Senator's anti-police agenda exposed." Ruth's fingers tightened around the phone, her frustration boiling over. It was the same narrative they always used to discredit her, the angry black woman trope, the accusation of being anti-police. She set the phone down, forcing herself to take slow, calming breaths. From the living room, Ella called out, "Mom, you okay?" Ruth's chest tightened. "Yeah, honey," she replied, her voice softer now. "Just a long day." But the truth was, her mind was racing. Ella didn't know about the anonymous emails Ruth had received earlier, threats thinly veiled as warnings, telling her to back off or face consequences. She didn't know about the smear campaign quietly building against them, fueled by whispers about Ruth's past and her supposed agenda. As Ruth moved to join Ella, she noticed the laptop screen glowing on the couch. Ella was scrolling through her social media feed, her brows furrowed. "Look at this, Mom," she said, turning the screen toward Ruth. It was a post, a photo of Ruth from the press conference, her expression fierce and defiant. But the caption was cruel, laced with venom. "This woman doesn't care about our safety," it read. She only cares about looking good for the cameras. #fake leader. Ruth's stomach churned, but she kept her voice calm. Don't let it get to you, Ella, she said. People will say anything to tear you down when you're making a difference. Ella frowned, her frustration mirroring Ruth's. It's not fair, she said. You're trying to help, and they're twisting everything. Ruth placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. I know it's hard, she said, but if we stop now, they win, and I'm not about to let that happen. The next morning, Ruth arrived at her office to find her chief of staff, Melanie, waiting with a grim expression. Ruth, we've got a problem, Melanie said, handing over a tablet. On the screen was an email chain, leaked to the press, insinuating that Ruth had cut deals with local activists to stage protests for her own political gain. It was baseless, of course, but the damage was already done. Ruth skimmed the article, her stomach sinking as she read the comments. The accusations were spreading like wildfire, her reputation under siege. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Ella. Mom, check Twitter. It's bad. Ruth's hands trembled as she opened the app, her heart sinking at what she saw. Ella's name was trending, her profile flooded with hateful messages. Your mom's a liar, one read. Like mother, like daughter. Another was even more vicious, attacking Ella's looks and intelligence. Ruth's chest tightened with a mix of rage and helplessness. This wasn't just about her anymore, they were going after Ella. Melanie, Ruth said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, set up a meeting with our legal team, and find out who's behind this smear campaign. Melanie nodded, her expression resolute. We'll get to the bottom of it, she said, but Ruth knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. That evening, Ruth stood in front of her bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her with tired eyes. The fight felt endless, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, but as she thought of Ella, her daughter's determination, her unwavering belief in justice, Ruth felt a spark reignite within her. She couldn't afford to falter, not now. The next day, Ruth returned to the precinct, unannounced. Turner was there, his smug expression firmly in place as she walked in. Back so soon, Senator? He said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Ruth ignored him, her focus razor-sharp. I'm here for answers, she said, and I'm not leaving until I get them. Turner chuckled, the sound grating. Good luck with that, he said, leaning back against his desk. You're not in charge here. Ruth stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. Not yet, she said, her voice low but powerful. But trust me, Officer Turner, your time is running out. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Turner's smirk faltered for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Ruth didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked out, her determination stronger than ever. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The office was dimly lit, a single desk lamp casting a pool of light over stacks of papers and a laptop with too many tabs open. Ruth Carter sat in her chair, her fingers poised over the keyboard, eyes scanning yet another document with a sharp intensity. She didn't feel the hour slipping away, nor the ache creeping into her back from sitting too long. All she felt was the steady hum of purpose, the familiar mix of anger and determination pushing her forward. There has to be more, she murmured to herself, her voice low but firm. Somewhere in these files, somewhere in the testimony of witnesses who were too scared to speak up or too ignored to matter, was the thread that would unravel everything. Turner's lies, his abuse of power, it was all there. She just needed to find it. Her phone buzzed beside her, jolting her out of her focus. Ella's name flashed on the screen, and Ruth quickly picked up. Hey baby, she said, her voice softening. Ella's voice on the other end was steady but tinged with frustration. Mom, I think I found something, she said, her words coming fast. That video from last month's protest, the one Turner said was fake, I found the original post. It's real, Mom. Someone re-uploaded it with the timestamp edited to make it look fake, but the real one is still out there. Ruth sat up straighter, her heart quickening. Send it to me, she said immediately. Good work, Ella, really good work. Ella's pride was evident even through the phone. I'll email it right now, she said. But Mom, be careful. I've been reading the comments on your posts, and some of them. She paused, her voice faltering. Some of them are really bad. Ruth's chest tightened. She wanted to reassure Ella, to tell her not to worry, but she couldn't bring herself to lie. I know, she said gently, but I'm okay. Don't let them scare you, all right? Ella hesitated, then sighed. Okay, just promise me you'll be careful. Ruth smiled, even though Ella couldn't see it. Always, she said before hanging up. Minutes later, the email came through, and Ruth clicked on the video link. Her stomach twisted as she watched. The footage was shaky, captured on a phone, but the scene was clear. Turner and two other officers were confronting a young man, their voices raised. The man, barely more than a teenager, had his hands up, palms out, but Turner shoved him hard enough to send him sprawling. The officers moved in, and the video cut off just as someone in the background shouted for help. Ruth's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a strategy. Turner wasn't just abusing his power, he was weaponizing it against the people he was supposed to serve. The next morning, Ruth stood in her living room, surrounded by boxes of files she had requested from city archives and community legal groups. Ella sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop open as she scrolled through social media threads and news articles. Mom, look at this, she said, tilting the screen so Ruth could see. It was a post from a local activist detailing a series of incidents involving Turner's precinct. Traffic stops that turned violent, complaints that mysteriously disappeared, names of victims who had tried to speak up and faced retaliation. Ruth leaned over, her heart sinking as she read. This is it, she said quietly. This is what we've been looking for. Ella's brow furrowed. But how do we prove it? They'll just say it's anecdotal, or that it's biased. Ruth straightened, her jaw set. We don't just prove it, she said. We show the pattern. We connect the dots so clearly that no one can deny it. She grabbed a pen and a pad of paper, her mind already racing. We need testimonies, documents, videos like the one you found, and we need to show that this isn't just about Turner, it's the whole system. As the hours ticked by, Ruth and Ella worked side by side, piecing together a timeline of events that painted a damning picture of the precinct's operations. Every new discovery added weight to Ruth's growing resolve, but it also deepened the pit in her stomach. The scale of what they were uncovering was staggering. How many people had been silenced? How many lives had been shattered while the system turned a blind eye? By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Ruth knew they had enough to take the next step, but she also knew the risks. Turner wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. He had already started framing her as an agitator, a politician exploiting tragedy for her own gain. The smear campaign was only going to get worse. And then there was the matter of her own past, a past that Turner would undoubtedly try to weaponize against her. Later that evening, Ruth sat in her office, staring at the wall where family photos hung in neat frames. One photo in particular drew her gaze, a younger version of herself, standing beside her late husband, holding a baby Ella in her arms. They had been so happy then, so full of hope. It was a reminder of what she was fighting for, not just justice for Jamil, but a better future for Ella and everyone like her. The thought gave her strength. The next day, Ruth called a meeting with her team to discuss their findings. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Melanie, her chief of staff, looked particularly grim. Ruth, she said, sliding a folder across the table. We've got a problem. Turner's team is pushing a new narrative. They're saying you've had a personal vendetta against him since that incident when you were 19. They're trying to paint this as a grudge, not a fight for justice." Ruth's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression calm. "Let them," she said firmly. "We stick to the facts. The evidence speaks for itself." Melanie nodded, though her worry didn't fade. "And the media attacks?" she asked. Ruth leaned forward, her voice steady. "We don't respond to noise, we focus on the work." As the meeting adjourned, Ruth's phone buzzed with a new notification. It was an article headline, "Senator Carter's Hidden Past. Is Her Fight Against Turner Personal?" Ruth read it quickly, her chest tightening with anger. The piece twisted the truth, dredging up her old arrest and framing it as the root of her current campaign. It was infuriating, but not unexpected. Turner was playing dirty, as she knew he would. That night, as Ruth sat at her desk reviewing their case, Ella appeared in the doorway. "Mom," she said hesitantly. Ruth looked up, her expression softening. "What is it, baby?" Ella hesitated, then stepped inside, holding her phone. "I've been reading the comments again," she admitted. "And I know you said not to let it get to me, but it's hard. They're saying horrible things about you, about us." Ruth's heart ached as she stood and wrapped her arms around Ella. "I know it's hard," she said gently, "but the truth always comes out, no matter how much they try to bury it. We just have to hold on." Ella nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said quietly. "I just hate that you have to go through this." The next morning, Ruth made her way to the precinct, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She had an appointment to meet with the precinct's internal affairs officer, but she knew Turner would be there too, watching her every move. As she walked through the doors, the room seemed to tense, officers glancing at her with a mix of curiosity and hostility. Turner was leaning against a desk, his smirk firmly in place. "Senator Carter," he said smoothly, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" Ruth met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "I'm here to speak with Internal Affairs," she said evenly. "I assume you're familiar with the concept of oversight, Officer Turner." His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Of course," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Always happy to cooperate with the system." As Ruth walked past him, she felt the weight of his gaze, but she didn't look back. This wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about justice, and she was going to get it, no matter what it took. The rain battered against the windows of Ruth Carter's office, each drop a sharp reminder of the pressure building outside. She sat behind her desk, the light from her laptop reflecting on her glasses as she scrolled through article after article. The headlines were relentless. Senator Carter's secret past, a juvenile arrest hidden for decades, Ruth Carter's crusade against police or personal vendetta. Each word felt like a slap, but Ruth's face betrayed nothing. Her hand hovered over her mouse, her jaw tight as she stared at the damning words on the screen. This was Turner's doing. She was sure of it. The man wasn't just trying to discredit her. He was digging into her past to destroy her completely. And the worst part, it was working. Kake. "Mom." Ella's voice broke through the tension, and Ruth looked up, startled. Ella stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her face pale. "You're all over the news," she said softly. "They're talking about that time when you were a teenager." Ruth felt a lump rise in her throat. She pushed her chair back and stood, closing the distance between them. "Ella," she began, her voice steady but heavy with regret. "I was going to tell you about that eventually. I just didn't think it would happen like this." Ella's brows knitted together, a mix of confusion and hurt flashing across her face. "Why didn't you tell me before? It's not like I'd care, Mom. Everyone makes mistakes." Ruth smiled weakly, brushing a strand of hair from Ella's face. "It wasn't a mistake," she said quietly. "It was a stand, and it's a story I need to share with you now, not as a politician, but as your mother." Ruth led Ella to the couch, the storm outside a perfect backdrop for the storm raging in her chest. "I was your age," Ruth began, her voice steady but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Back then, this city wasn't as big, but it was just as divided. I was walking home from a friend's house when a cop car pulled up. I wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking, but they stopped me anyway. Asked me questions I couldn't answer, like why I thought I had a right to be in that part of town." Ella's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "What happened?" she whispered. Ruth sighed, her gaze distant. "I told them I didn't have to answer, that this was my neighborhood too. They didn't like that. They put me in handcuffs and drove me to the precinct. They called it loitering, but we both know what it really was." Ruth paused, her voice trembling slightly. "That's where I met Turner for the first time. He wasn't a sergeant then, just a rookie, but I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like I was nothing." Ella reached out and squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, that doesn't make you look bad. It makes you look brave." Ruth smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, baby, but the world doesn't always see it that way, and Turner's going to twist it into something ugly." The next morning, Ruth arrived at City Hall to find protesters gathered outside. Some held signs of support, while others carried messages demanding her resignation. "Carter out," a man shouted as she passed, his voice cutting through the din. Ruth didn't flinch. She walked through the crowd with her head high, her resolve unshaken despite the weight pressing down on her. Inside, her team was already waiting, their faces tense. Melanie, her chief of staff, stood as Ruth entered. "We've got a new problem," Melanie said, handing over a folder. Ruth opened it and scanned the contents, her stomach sinking. It was a statement from Turner, filled with veiled accusations. "Senator Carter's history with this precinct has clearly biased her actions," it read. "Her personal vendetta undermines the integrity of her office and our ability to serve the community." Ruth set the folder down, her hands trembling with controlled anger. "He's trying to frame me as the problem," she said, her voice low. Melanie nodded. "And it's working. Public opinion is split. People are questioning whether this is about justice or revenge." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation threatening to crush her. When she opened them, her gaze was steady. "We fight back," she said firmly. "We show them the truth." That evening, Ruth visited Jamil Bennett at his family's small apartment. His mother answered the door, her face lined with worry. "Senator Carter," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming." Ruth stepped inside, her heart aching at the sight of Jamil sitting on the couch, his arm in a sling and bruises still visible on his face. "Jamil," she said gently, sitting beside him. "How are you holding up?" Jamil met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "I'm not giving up," he said. "Not after everything you've done for me." Ruth smiled, a flicker of hope lighting her chest. "That's what I wanted to hear," she said. "But I have to ask you something, and it won't be easy." Jamil straightened, his jaw tightening. "You want me to testify," he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth nodded. "I won't pressure you, Jamil. This is your choice, but your voice could change everything." Jamil looked away, his hands clenched into fists. "They've already threatened my family," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can put them in more danger." Ruth placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you," she said. "But know this, your courage could save lives." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Jamil nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll do it," he said. "I won't let them scare me." The next day, Ruth held a press conference to announce Jamil's decision. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as Ruth stepped up to the podium. Jamil Bennett has agreed to testify about the abuse he suffered at the hands of this precinct, she said, her voice steady. This isn't about one officer or one incident. It's about a pattern of injustice that must end. As she spoke, she noticed Turner standing at the back of the room, his arms crossed and a smirk playing on his lips. He was already planning his next move. She could see it in his eyes. But Ruth didn't falter. She finished her speech with a promise. No matter how hard they try to silence us, we will not back down. That evening, Ruth sat in her office, the day's events replaying in her mind. The stakes had never been higher, and the risks were greater than ever. But as she looked at the photo of Ella on her desk, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just for Jamil or her community. It was for the future, for every child who deserved to grow up in a world where justice was more than a dream. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her thoughts. It was a message from Melanie. Turner's camp is planning a counterattack. Be ready. Ruth stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She was ready. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't going anywhere. The town hall was packed, every seat filled and people standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickled on the skin and made every whisper sound like a roar. Ruth Carter stood just off stage, clutching a folder of evidence so tightly that the edges of the papers were beginning to curl. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face was calm. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, their voices filled with a mix of anger, hope, and doubt. This was her moment. This was their moment. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You've got this," Ella whispered from beside her. Ruth turned, meeting her daughter's steady gaze. Ella's presence was a lifeline, grounding her in the storm. "I've got this," Ruth repeated, her voice firm. The moderator tapped the microphone, calling the room to order. The low hum of conversation quieted, replaced by an expectant silence. Ruth stepped onto the stage, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the polished wood. She scanned the crowd, taking in their faces. Some were familiar, supporters, friends, community members she had fought for over the years. Others were strangers, their expressions guarded, skeptical. And then there was Greg Turner, seated near the back, his arms crossed and a smirk playing on his lips. He looked so sure of himself, so untouchable. It made Ruth's blood boil, but she channeled that anger into resolve. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "I know why you're here. You're here because you care about our community. You care about justice. And tonight, I'm going to show you the truth." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer. This is about a pattern, a system that has failed us over and over again." Turner shifted in his seat, his smirk fading slightly. He hadn't expected her to come out swinging, but Ruth wasn't here to play it safe. She opened the folder in her hands, pulling out the first piece of evidence, a transcript of a police radio recording from the night of the protest. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a transcript of orders given by Officer Turner during the protest that left Jamil Bennett in critical condition. I'd like to play the recording for you now." A hush fell over the room as the audio began to play. Turner's voice crackled through the speakers, clear and unmistakable. "I don't care how peaceful they say they are," his voice snarled. "Break it up. Use whatever force you need to send them home." The room erupted into murmurs, shock rippling through the crowd. Turner's face darkened, but he didn't move. Ruth pressed on, her voice cutting through the noise. "These are not the words of someone trying to protect and serve. These are the words of someone who sees power as a weapon to be used against the people he's sworn to protect." The murmurs turned into shouts of anger, voices demanding answers, demanding justice. Turner stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a circus," he barked, his voice echoing in the room. "Senator Carter is twisting the truth to serve her own agenda. That recording doesn't tell the whole story." Ruth turned to him, her gaze unyielding. "Then tell us, Officer Turner," she said, her voice steady. "What part of that story justifies ordering violence against peaceful protesters?" Turner opened his mouth, but before he could respond, the door at the back of the room opened. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was older, his hair silver, but his posture straight and strong. He walked to the front of the room with purpose, his eyes locked on Turner. Ruth's heart leaped in recognition. It was Chief Roberts, retired after nearly 40 years on the force. She hadn't seen him in years, but his reputation as a fair and honorable man had preceded him. "Senator Carter," Roberts said, his deep voice carrying through the room. "May I speak?" Ruth nodded, stepping aside to give him the floor. Roberts turned to face the crowd, his expression grave. "I served with Greg Turner for the first 10 years of his career," he began, "and what I saw during that time still haunts me. Turner didn't just bend the rules, he broke them, repeatedly, and he was protected by a system that valued loyalty over accountability." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Roberts as he spoke. He detailed incident after incident, Turner falsifying reports, using excessive force, intimidating witnesses. Each story was a blow, chipping away at the facade Turner had built for himself. By the time Roberts finished, the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "This man," Roberts said, pointing directly at Turner, "has no place in law enforcement. He never did." The crowd erupted, their voices a cacophony of anger and applause. Turner's face was pale, his smug confidence shattered. He tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Ruth stepped back to the podium, raising her hands to quiet the room. "Thank you, Chief Roberts," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "Your courage is what this community needs. It's what we all need." She turned back to the crowd, her voice rising above the noise. "This is what happens when we stand together, when we demand accountability. Tonight, we've taken the first step toward justice, but our work isn't done. We have to keep fighting, for Jamil, for every victim who didn't have a voice, for the future of our community." The room erupted into cheers, the sound echoing through the building. Ruth felt a swell of hope, of pride, as she stepped back from the podium. She caught Ella's eye in the crowd, her daughter's face shining with pride and determination. For the first time in weeks, Ruth felt like they were winning, but deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, waiting for the moment everything would break. Greg Turner sat at the defense table, his once confident smirk now replaced with a mask of exhaustion and thinly veiled anger. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Turner didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table like it might keep him from falling apart. Ruth Carter sat across the aisle, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but watchful. Beside her, Jamil Bennett sat with his mother, his arms still in a sling, but his head held high. The scars on his face hadn't faded, but neither had his resolve. Ruth glanced at him and gave a small nod of encouragement. He returned it, his lips pressing into a determined line. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the judge entered the room. Everyone stood, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing second. As they sat again, the judge's voice rang out, firm and measured. After reviewing the evidence presented and hearing the testimonies of all involved, this court finds Gregory Turner guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and assault. The words hit like a thunderclap. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. the sound of justice finally landing after what felt like an eternity. Ruth didn't move, didn't breathe, until she heard the next words. "He is hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison." Turner's head dropped, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions and the consequences finally bore down on him. The media outside exploded. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust forward like weapons. "Senator Carter, how does it feel to see Turner convicted? Do you think this will lead to real change?" Ruth stepped out of the courthouse, her posture as straight and strong as ever, and faced the crowd. "Today is a step forward," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. "But it is only a step. True justice isn't about one conviction, it's about changing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Her words echoed across television screens, radios, and social media feeds, sparking conversations and debates in homes, schools, and offices. The story was everywhere: how Ruth Carter, a senator who had once been a scared 19-year-old arrested by the same precinct, had fought to expose the truth. How a young man named John Bennett had the courage to testify, despite the threats against him. How a community had stood together to demand accountability and refused to be silenced. In the weeks that followed, Ruth worked tirelessly. The momentum from Turner's conviction gave her the leverage she needed to push for reforms she had been fighting for her entire career. She introduced the Police Accountability and Transparency Act, a sweeping bill that demanded independent oversight of police misconduct cases, mandatory body cameras, and increased funding for community-based safety programs. "This isn't about being anti-police," Ruth said during a live press conference. "It's about being pro-justice. It's about making sure the people who swear to protect us are held to the same standards as everyone else." The backlash was immediate. Opponents called her bill unrealistic, dangerous, even un-American. But Ruth was ready. She met every criticism with facts, every insult with unshakable calm. "What's truly un-American," she said in a heated debate on national television, "is a system that allows power to go unchecked. What's un-American is turning a blind eye to injustice." Ella watched it all from the sidelines, her pride in her mother growing with each passing day. But it wasn't just pride, it was inspiration. One evening, as Ruth sat at the kitchen table going over amendments to the bill, Ella approached her, holding a folder of her own. "What's this?" Ruth asked, raising an eyebrow. Ella grinned nervously. "It's a proposal for a youth-led initiative to promote social justice education in schools. I want to call it Generation Justice." Ruth's heart swelled. She flipped through the folder, her eyes skimming over Ella's carefully thought-out plans and notes. "Ella, this is incredible," she said, her voice soft with emotion. Ella shrugged, but her smile widened. "I guess I get it from you," she said. Jimnal's life began to change as well. He received a formal settlement from the city, along with a public apology that aired during a special press conference. "While no amount of money can erase the pain and trauma I've endured," Jimnal said, standing tall before the cameras, "this is a step toward healing, not just for me, but for our entire community." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt something close to peace. Despite the victories, Ruth couldn't shake the weight of everything it had taken to get here. Late one night, as she sat alone in her living room, a mug of tea cooling in her hands, she let herself feel it all: the exhaustion, the anger, the grief for the years lost to fighting battles that should never have existed in the first place. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Chief Roberts, the retired officer who had testified against Turner. "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak," it read. "You've done something extraordinary." Ruth smiled, a small, weary smile, and set the phone down. She glanced at the framed photo on the mantel, her younger self with Ella as a baby, her late husband's arm around them. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. We actually did it." The reforms passed after months of tireless work and intense debate. It wasn't perfect. Change never was, but it was a start. The system wasn't fixed overnight, but cracks were forming in the foundation of injustice, and through those cracks, light began to shine. The final town hall meeting was held in the same community center where Ruth had first confronted Turner. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was hope in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Ruth stood at the podium, Ella by her side, and addressed the crowd. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice strong and steady. "It's the beginning of something better, and together we'll keep building." As the crowd erupted into applause, chanting her name, Ruth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She looked at Ella, who was smiling so brightly it could light up the room, and knew that no matter how hard the fight had been, it had been worth it. Because justice wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a reality they had built, brick by brick, together. The auditorium was buzzing with energy, the kind of excitement that hummed in the air and made everyone sit a little taller. Rows of families, teachers, and students filled the seats, their faces glowing with pride and anticipation. Ruth Carter sat near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a program for the ceremony resting against her knee. She glanced down at it, her heart swelling as her eyes landed on a single name, Ella Carter. For a moment, everything else faded. The noise, the whispers, the clapping, and all she could see was her daughter's name. Her Ella, the girl who had watched her fight against the odds and somehow found the strength to carve her own path. A voice crackled over the speakers, calling the room to attention. "Welcome to the 2024 graduation ceremony," the principal announced, his tone warm and full of pride. The room erupted into cheers and applause, and Ruth felt a lump rise in her throat. She looked up at the stage, where rows of caps and gowns shimmered under the bright lights. Somewhere among them was Ella, her smile as radiant as the future she was about to step into. Ruth couldn't see her from this angle, but she didn't need to. She could feel Ella's presence, her energy, the way she always could. The speeches began, each one heartfelt and full of the usual platitudes about dreams and hard work. Ruth listened politely, clapping in the right places, but her mind kept drifting. Images of the past few months played like a film reel in her head. Turner's conviction, the passing of the reform bill, Jamal standing tall as he delivered his testimony. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Her chest tightened as she thought of the lives that had been changed, the lives still waiting to be healed. The work wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today wasn't about the fight. Today was about Ella. "Now," the principal said, his voice pulling Ruth back to the present, "it is my great honor to introduce our valedictorian, Ella Carter." Ruth's heart skipped a beat as the room erupted into applause. She leaned forward in her seat, her eyes locked on the stage as Ella stepped up to the podium. Her daughter looked radiant, her gown flowing as she walked with the kind of confidence Ruth had only dreamed of at her age. Ella adjusted the microphone, her hands steady, and began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the room. "When I sat down to write this speech, I thought about all the usual things people say at graduations, about dreams and hard work, about how this is just the beginning, and all of that is true. But today, I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about resilience." The room quieted, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she watched her daughter command the room, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. "Resilience isn't just about surviving," Ella continued. "It's about thriving, even when the odds are stacked against you. It's about standing tall, even when the world tries to knock you down. I learned that from my mom." Ruth's eyes widened, her heart swelling as Ella turned to look directly at her. "My mom is the strongest person I know. Ella said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. She taught me that change isn't something we wait for, it's something we fight for. She showed me what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. And because of her, I know that we can make the world a better place. The audience erupted into applause, but Ruth barely noticed. She was too busy blinking back tears, her chest tight with a mix of pride and love so overwhelming it left her breathless. Ella's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, a small smile playing on her lips, before she turned back to the audience. So as we leave here today, Ella said, her voice rising with conviction, I want all of us to remember that we have the power to create change. We have the power to make a difference. And no matter how hard it gets, we can't give up. Because resilience isn't just about us, it's about the people we fight for. The room erupted into a standing ovation, the sound deafening. Ruth stood with the rest of them, clapping until her hands ached, her heart full to bursting. She watched as Ella stepped down from the podium, her head held high, her smile as bright as the future she had just described. And in that moment, Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out onto the lawn, families embracing, laughter and chatter filling the warm afternoon air. Ruth stood near the edge of the crowd, scanning for Ella. When she finally spotted her, weaving through the sea of caps and gowns, Ruth felt her breath catch. Ella saw her at the same moment and broke into a run, her gown billowing behind her. She threw her arms around Ruth, squeezing her tightly. I'm so proud of you, Ruth whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. So proud. Ella pulled back, her eyes shining. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom, she said. Everything I am, it's because of you. Ruth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, baby, she said. Everything you are, it's because of you. As they stood there, holding each other in the middle of the crowd, Ruth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were truly winning. She thought of the community she had fought so hard for, the changes they had begun to see, the lives they had touched. She thought of Jomel, who was now working with a local youth program to help kids find their voices. She thought of Chief Roberts, who had come out of retirement to lead the precinct under a new vision of accountability and trust. And she thought of Ella, her beautiful, brilliant daughter, who had found her own voice and was using it to inspire others. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Ruth and Ella walked home together, their hands intertwined. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood that had once been a symbol of everything Ruth wanted to change. Now it was a symbol of everything they had accomplished, and everything they still had to fight for. When they reached their front porch, Ruth paused, looking out at the street, the houses, the people who were starting to believe in a better future. She turned to Ella, her smile soft but full of determination. We've come a long way, she said. Ella nodded, her gaze steady, and we're just getting started. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them, leaving the world outside for just a little while. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ruth allowed herself to dream, not just of justice, but of joy.